Hello! In this video, we're going to be looking at how does reading work? This video builds on an earlier video I did on reading models. I will provide a link to that for your reference. And we're going to be looking at it specifically from the perspective of a socio-psycholinguistic reading model. This is the reading model that underpins the curriculum and all literacy support documents in Ontario, the jurisdiction that I work in. The key that we want to remember when we're doing this is that reading is a process and that we use the cueing systems together to make meaning. The first cueing system we're going to look at is semantics. So what I'd like you to do now is to read through this paragraph. Just read it once. Write down anything that you remember. Do not reread the sentence. I have a question for you. How many of you wrote down the basic ideas in the story? Now, how many of you paid attention to the typos? And out of you who noticed that there were typos, how many typos did you catch? Right? If we go along, we notice there's boot instead of boat. Though instead of through. Apart instead of apart. Should have instead of should have. The is written down twice. He should be she. If you pay attention to these errors, a number of them are playing on other cueing systems. So, boot for boat. When we look at words, we use a graphophonic cueing system. And so we look at how they look. And we predict what we think the right word should be. And so it's really hard to catch an error like that. The same with the. The pragmatic cueing systems, we've got the context. And so we read the at the end of the sentence. We don't catch that it's repeated at the beginning of the sentence. Similarly, if you look at he, it's preceded by so. And so our brains just see the S on the he because of the context. The heart of the literacy process is semantics. And it's the cueing systems working together for us to make meaning. At its simplest, semantics is meaning. But it's not that simple. When we're talking about meaning here, it's the meaning between the reader or the literacy user and the text. And so it's the transaction between them and the context that the reading is being done in that creates the meaning. The meaning does not remain in a text sterile. It is that transaction between the reader and the book or the text. The next cueing system we're going to look at is the graphophonic cueing system. And so what I want you to do is to read these two sentences. The first one only has vowels, no consonants. We'll see if you can read it. The second one has no vowels, only consonants. So take a minute and try and read those. If you need more time, pause the video. So the translation of the first one should be easy because we just read it. It says, a woman was building a boat in her basement. We just read that sentence. And the second one is a quote from the Rainbow Goblins. And it's, soon all the colors of the rainbow will be ours. I've gotten this idea from Vera Goodman and her book, Simply Read, Helping Others Learn How to Read. And so this slide is to show you how we use graphophonics. But also, if you're a teacher and you're trying to help students, you can see that it makes much more sense to focus on the consonants than the vowels. Vowels are incredibly irregular. I've got another one here for you. So try to read this text. Now, the reason why you can read this, and I think most of you should be able to read it, is because as readers, we don't sound out every letter in every word we're reading. We are constantly predicting, sampling, and confirming. We don't need every sound to make meaning of a text. When we're reading, we're trying to make meaning, and our eyes are only sampling parts of the words that we're reading. There's some really interesting eye movement studies that back this up. If you're interested in some more reading about that, Alan Flurkey has done some excellent work. So graphophonics is the way in which we interact with the literacy. It's in reading, it's the way that the words look and the way that they sound. In my work, I often refer to this as the sensory cueing system because it's the way in which we interact with the literacy and the way in which most literacies are unique. So for example, my daughter, Emily, is a dancer and a writer and a reader. And the way in which she interacts with dance is through movement and rhythm. And the way in which she interacts with reading is graphophonics. And if she's viewing a video, she's using sight and sound cues. And if she's writing, she's also using graphophonics. But she's using graphophonics to produce a text as opposed to consume a text. And that's the way in which reading and writing differ, is the purpose. And so we use the way in which we interact with the literacy and its purpose defines why we have different literacies. And on that note, we're going to look at the syntactic cueing system. I want you to read this nonsense story. And pay close attention because there is going to be a test in a minute. This text comes directly from Ken Goodman's On Reading. An excellent text if you want to do more reading about how reading works. So here are the questions. Why was Gliss flapper? Now here, I'm going to make it a little bit more easy for you. I'm going to put both together. It's because she had denarpened Farfy's Marsden. What did Gliss plimp? She plimped the Marston binky for Farfy. Who jabberted in the Gorger when Gliss denarpened the binky? Well, it's obvious. It's Farfie. And what did Farfie boff about the Marston Binky? That's a Kurdish Marston Binky. Now here's the final one. This is a little bit tricky. We'll see if you can get it because you can't. You notice we've just been cutting and pasting between the text. On this last question, it requires you to use a little bit of deductive reasoning. Why did Gliss wank Farfie his Geberter? I'm sure most of you figured out that it's because she didn't telp a Geberter for Farfie. Or she didn't wank Farfie his Geberter because it's on Stanston. I mean, that should be obvious. Now, Ken used this nonsense text to help us understand how syntax works. You can see that all the words in this nonsense story use proper syntax and proper grammatical rules. And so we're actually able to answer this standard test that we would see at the end of a reading without us having any sort of significant understanding of the story that we just read. And so when I'm thinking about assessing a student's reading and whether or not they understood a text, I use a simple tool. It's called a retell, where the students tell you the story and the significant parts of the story that they just read. And then you have a dialogue about the story and you quickly understand whether or not a student understood the text that they were reading. Now, I'm going to give you a hint. So if I change it to a birthday present for Farfie, does that help you understand the rest of the text? All that Ken did was simple word substitutions. But he did an excellent job at showing us how syntax works in reading. So for us, syntax is the rules that govern a literacy. It's a cueing system that gives literacies order and predictability. Rules are more or less rigid depending on the literacy that they're being used in. So for example, written language is much more rigid than spoken language. The final cueing system that we're going to look at is pragmatics. Now for this one, I don't have an example for you. We've been using it throughout the other examples. Pragmatics is the context within and without a literacy. And so it can be thought of the context in which the literacy event or occurrence happens, or it can be everything that comes before and everything that's going to come after. And so if you're reading a story and you come to a sentence and you come to a word that you don't understand, or you come to a sentence that you don't understand, or a paragraph, a good strategy that we often will use is to stop and go back to see if we had made an error in our readings and our understanding of what we were reading. Now, the other thing is that depending on the context we are in, the way in which we interact with the literacy is very different. So the example that I like to use is many people that I talk to hate books that they read in high school because they were required to read them. I had taken the liberty to read many of the books that I read in high school over the summer because, you know, I'm a bit of a geek. And so I had read them on my own. And so I love books like Lord of the Flies and, quite frankly, Shakespeare and War of the Worlds and the Chrysalids that many of my friends absolutely hate and had to read in school. And so the context matters. And finally, when we look at the socio-psycholinguistic reading model, it's important that we remember we use all of the cueing systems together to create meaning. And that the reading is a process. We're constantly predicting, sampling, and confirming whether or not a text makes sense. Fluent readers use all of the cueing systems when they read. For students, though, to access the semantic, graphophonic, and syntactic cueing systems, they must be exposed to texts that are meaningful and purposeful in their lives. It makes sense to try to find books that children enjoy, because then it will motivate them to read and to read more. Anyhow, that's how reading works. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I look forward to our discussion in class. Thank you very much.